Today I want to talk about a pretty unusual topic, and it's probably going to be less coherent than usual, sorry for that. But the thing is, I've been playing and watching StarCraft 2 since 2011, and over the years I couldn't help but notice how drastically each race's playstyle has changed. It genuinely feels like with every passing year we're drifting further and further away from the original concepts that Blizzard built into the game's design. So I wanna break down from both a game design and lore perspective how we went from those original ideas to the current meta and why sometimes it feels a bit off. The biggest shift, at least for me, is with Zerg and Protoss, so let's go through them one by one. Starting with Zerg, originally this race perfectly represented the spirit of the Swarm. A Zerg player was supposed to build huge masses of chip units and overwhelm the opponent with sheer numbers. The Zerg usually took heavier losses, but could compensate thanks to their stronger economy. It was a simple yet extremely organic design, and in Wings of Liberty was executed perfectly. In a way, Zerg were like weeds, or, like a cockroach infestation in a house. At first they're weak and almost defenseless, there are not many of them, and other races just have to wipe them out before they spread. But if the Zerg did manage to grow, dealing with them becomes much harder. You could even see this in their units and strategies. This was the true Zerg Rush identity, and if you watch old highlights, it's almost always wave after wave of Linkbane attacks or even transitions into Broodlord and Infestors. Yes, it was a late game composition, but it still stayed true to the Zerg fantasy. Broodlords spamming Broodlings everywhere and Infestors spamming infested Terrans, basically flooding the battlefield with bodies. How to the Swarm was pretty much the same. Zerg relied on massive unit counts, either Linkbane Muta once again, or Hydra Roach and sometimes Vipers, constantly pressuring Terrans and Protoss alike. And yeah, we of course cannot forget about the cursed Swarm host, which was probably a terrible idea if we talk about the balance, but from a lore standpoint, they still fit perfectly, because Swarm hosts produced endless waves of little units that opponents had to push back again and again, fighting the Swarm. And another important thing, back then other races did not feel nearly as comfortable on the map. Usually it was the Zerg who took over the whole map, while the other race just clung to a small corner and then was slowly expanding outwards, constantly fighting this nasty Swarm. In today's meta, it's not a rare thing to see Protoss take their third only slightly later than Zerg, and sometimes they even take it earlier if we talk about the fourth base. And this is something that would have been unthinkable in the early years of StarCraft 2. For a while, in the early years of Legacy of the Void, that original design philosophy still held strong. We had Ravager pushes, we had some Hydra timings, Linkbane Hydra in ZVP, and many other things that were kinda fun to play with. But in today's meta, Zerg play has transformed completely, especially if we take a look at the pro level. I already talked about that in another video, but this race has shifted almost entirely from constant aggression and mid-grinder pushes into long, drawn-out defensive play all the way to the late game, specifically to lurkers and the whole network of supporting casters. The Zerg army gradually stopped being cheap, expendable units and instead became a high-tech, high-value composition requiring 2 or sometimes even 3 types of casters and siege units at once. This includes lurkers, broodlords, vipers, infestors, and sometimes queens. The ideal playstyle for Zerg race, even in mid-game, is no longer just mindless waves of Linkbanes with Hydras and maybe mindless waves of Roaches and Hydras. Now it's lurkers, broodlords, and all other supporting units. This mix is extremely micro-intensive, but at the same time it's so powerful that it outright beats most Terran and Protoss armies head-on. And this is something that really feels odd to me. Back in the day when I was a young lad and I was just starting playing StarCraft 2, I picked Zerg exactly because of that old-school playstyle. I had absolutely terrible micro, but still, I was kinda fast, I had high APM and solid multitasking, at least for that level, and I loved expanding everywhere and just suffocating my opponents with constant aggression and a massive economy. Sure, I was bad at micro, but it was not a problem because I could sacrifice tons of links and banes and then just rebuild them, providing I had a strong early game and I was fast enough with my map control, economy, creep tumors, and so on. And if you remember the whole lore about the Zerg race, and even in the esports community, remember Tempo's song Drawn So Hard? This song just inspired me so much to play Zerg, I cannot even tell you how defining it was for me. But now, it's completely different. It's just an experience that is more similar to Protoss race back in the old days. You just wait to build an ultimate late game army. Unless of course you are playing an all-in or a cheese timing. And of course this change didn't happen only to Zerg, because Protoss evolved in a very interesting way as well. Originally, Protoss were designed as the expensive, high-tech race. Their units were stronger, but losing them was extremely punishing. So in Wings of Liberty and How to Do Swarm, Protoss had two reliable playstyles. The first one was defensive macro into one big, powerful late-game army composition. They were basically buying time with small pokes here and there and just waiting for the Colossi and sometimes Sky Toss as well. That death pool usually included High Templars and, of course, the mothership with the Vortex, especially in Wings of Liberty. And that composition was insanely strong. It was a very passive playstyle that aimed to end the game with one big fight. The second option was a huge variety of timing attacks, from simple cheeses to risky 2-base all-ins. Protoss had a massive arsenal of 2-base build orders, and in 2014 almost every Protoss champion relied on a mix of different pushes and pressure timings across all matchups. This was a pretty ridiculous thing back in the old days, and many Zergs actually complained about that because executing some timing attacks was inherently easier than playing a full-blown macro game. And, you know, we even had some weird examples as Scarlet switching her race to Protoss and playing one game against Don Regu and actually winning that with a gate all-in. That was actually pretty fun, but overall that risky playstyle worked thanks to two things. It was extremely tight microcontrol and the element of surprise. The latter was probably even more important. And because the How to Do Swarm economy was different and bases actually lasted longer, Protoss could even go for very late all-ins. Sometimes they even included really strong tier T units such as Colossi, and sometimes they could even transition into macro if they at least dealt some damage. This was possible because there wasn't the same amount of pressure to constantly expand as it is nowadays when your base runs dry in about 8 minutes. Of course, in Legacy of the Void everything changed because of the new economy. For Protoss, things actually got a bit harder. The front line became wider since you now need to take more bases and also protect them. And relying purely on expensive units became a lot tougher, well, because you just cannot place all your Colossi or Disruptors or Storms across 5 or 6 bases. This is just impossible, and Protoss needed something else, so they started giving more and more buffs to their tier 1 units, pushing them toward a more aggressive playstyle. The best example is the period when Zealots had bonus damage on their first hit with charge. Back then, almost every Protoss player used a meatball army with tons of Zealots, a handful of Stalkers, and sometimes Archons for support and maybe High Templars for the late game if they couldn't finish the game in time. And free base all-ins and big timings were everywhere. And honestly, nobody really liked that design because it didn't really fit the lore and the general idea behind the high-tech elite race. In the current meta, Protoss still rely a lot on tier 1 or tier 2 units, but luckily all the playstyles are kinda more or less balanced now. The shift toward cheaper units was purely for balance reasons, otherwise the race would probably lose even more games due to just throwing away expensive tier 3 carries all the time. That's really hard to control. The last race, Terran, across all 15 years of StarCraft 2 has been the most stable race. They sit right in the middle between Zerg and Protoss, and I think Terrans are the ones who have preserved their identity the best. Their playstyle today is still incredibly similar to how they played in the early years of StarCraft 2 release. They are still a hyper-aggressive race that can fight with cheap, scrappy units or switch to a more passive, expensive mech style or maybe even expensive Liberators and mass Ghosts. My thoughts jump around a bit here, it's kinda difficult to vocalize this concern that I have, but to put it simply, for me, StarCraft 2 is harder to understand nowadays because each race's core identity has massively shifted. Zerg no longer overwhelms with numbers. They often go into a slow, high-tech bug army that just grinds the opponent down with expensive units. Protoss have become way more aggressive, relying less on elite units and much more on constant pressure with cheap ones like Zealots, Stalkers, and so on. Terran, in my opinion, is the only race that still feels absolutely right. Is this actually a problem though? From the balance perspective, no, of course no. Legacy of the Void plays fast and it feels great, but from a game design perspective, it's a bit weird. Personally, I wanna see playstyles that at least somehow match the lore and identity of each race. I wanna see massive Zerg floods like in the How to Do Swarm trailer, and I wanna see the epic Protoss Last Stand style from Legacy of the Void. I wanna feel like I'm commanding a gigantic swarm consuming every planet it touches, not a hit squad of space insects, you know? In other words, for the sake of balance, the game moved away from the identity that made StarCraft 2 so cool in the campaign and even in the early years of multiplayer. These identities have blurred so much that the races don't really reflect the reasons many players originally fell in love with them. So nowadays, as a Zerg main myself, I'm forced to play more like a Protoss rather than how I played 10 years ago or maybe even 15 years ago when I just bought this game. I cannot really think of a conclusion for this video, this is just an interesting observation I've been thinking about the past couple of years. I don't think that's a big problem, and I don't really think that this is something that should be immediately changed, but, you know, I'm really curious what you guys think about it. Am I the only one who feels that the current meta is slightly strange, even though it's balanced and it's fun to play? Let me know in the comments, please. Thank you for watching, and check out other RTS videos. Good luck, and see you next time.